Before I start this, I'll make a comparison to make a possibly it clearer. One side of my family is Catholic, and one side is Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox. Now, if I was to try and explain the various traditions on both sides, we'd be here a very long time, and I have more interest in it, to be frank, than the Eastern Orthodox side of my family, who find me going on about theology a pain in their head, so I don't often do it. But recently, there's been some talk about the Temple Mount I've run into on a couple of sites and why people can't pray on it. Now, that whole situation is absurdly complicated and mired in history that goes back thousands of years. And it reminds me of the old kind of joke, or you could call it a saying, or even a proverb almost by this point, that if you ask two rabbis a question, you are likely to get three answers, or at least three answers. But people talking about the Temple Mount often seem to approach it as though it's all the fault of just one side or the other, and don't share why prayer is banned on there at the moment, or give you a basic historical background. Now, I can only give you on YouTube, unless I'm willing to sit here for hours, a very basic historical background, and people are free to agree or disagree with me or correct me as well. I don't claim to be an all knowing icon. But here's 13 facts about the temple, Mount Haram al Sharif, and the struggle of the temple movements, which might lend you some background. Historical and religious background. The Temple Mount, known in Arabic as Haram Sharif, is the site of the first and second temples. Since the destruction of the second temple, Judaism abandoned the practice of animal sacrifices and shifted towards congregational prayer, what we might call nowadays rabbinical Judaism. In the 7th century, Muslims established the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock on the site. According to Muslim belief, Prophet Muhammad's night journey from Mecca concluded at Al-Aqsa. From the 12th century onwards, entry to the compound was restricted to non-Muslims. During the 19th century, a process of opening the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, to non-Muslim visitors began, but prayer by non-Muslims was prohibited. But the current ban on prayer up there and the current status quo is where I'm interested, is the next one. What is the status quo on the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif? The status quo was established by Israel itself in 1967. And of course, it's caused a huge amount of controversy, with many Jewish people in Israel not being very happy about it. But there are also arguments in Jewish law about how permissible it is to even go on the Temple Mount, with people taking positions for or against it, saying you can visit bits of it, other bits are off limits, and so on. The whole thing is incredibly complex and interleaved. And it would be nice if people going on about the Temple Mount gave some hint of all this messy, entangled stuff going on in the background and didn't just pass over it in one line. The decision was, it's erasing certainty, of course they will if it serves a certain agenda. The decision was to leave the day-to-day management of the site in the hands of the Islamic Waqf and to allow only Muslim prayer. Well, yes, because they probably didn't want a great amount of rioting or huge problems, to be fair about it. And if you swip the shit round the other way, there are situations where you could imagine if you banned Jewish prayers under the British mandate of Palestinians, you'd have got similar reactions. This decision was reinforced by the chief rabbinate of Israel, which prohibited Jewish prayers on the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif for halakhic reasons. Now, that gives you some background. As I say, it's not an uncontroversial decision, and people have argued against the chief rabbinate and argue that it could be quite possible for people to go up there, but it's nice if people provide context. The status quo enshrines the priority of Muslim prayer over any other activity on the compound, including Jewish visitation, or me as a Christian if I go up there, ascent to the mount. Both sides refrain from formulating the understandings in writing. The central challenge to the status quo began with their ascent of the temple movements and their demand to pray on the mount. And now that gives you some background. And you can read the rest, because if I read all 13 of those out, I'll be going on and on and on and on and on. But at least it gives you some background. And it should be pointed out that historically in the ancient world, the temple was banned for pagans or foreigners from entering as well, or parts of it at least. Here we have the Armstrong Institute of Biblical Archaeology. Now, the Armstrong Institute of Biblical Archaeology, and I'll put my cards on the table, is a Christian institute and presents the Bible as a resource that's to be trusted. So for balance, I've also got a Jewish resource up there. The 150-year anniversary of finding the closest confirmed temple artifacts. Now, this stone contains an inscription telling sort of foreigners that they shouldn't approach or they shouldn't enter certain parts of the temple, by which it means non-Jews. These inscriptions are particularly special because they are well documented by eyewitnesses. The temple in classical antiquity, the 1st century CE Jewish historian Josephus described it in a courtyard stone border wall containing inscriptions, ashlars at equal distance from one another, declaring the law of purity, some in Greek, some in Latin letters, that no foreigner should go within that sanctuary, War of the Jews. Now, this sort of stuff gives you some context to work on rather than coming out with simplistic statements, and it gives the viewer something to work with to put it in a bigger context. But funny enough, certain historical channels seem to have, who claim to be historical channels, didn't do that. And here's CBN Israel with the same stone and talking about it as well in repeating some of the same information. All of that should give you an idea of how insanely messy the history of praying on the Temple Mount is. And it's not just a case of it's been a simple matter to sum up. It's not something you can arrive at a simple conclusion on, and it's a source of a huge amount of controversy in Israel. And once you understand that and why it was banned and what after the 6-Day War, you might be able to make a slightly more informed judgment on it. You might come down on one side or another. You might view it as being perfectly permissible and not see what the fuss is. You might view Israel as being wrong to prevent it, as many Jewish people in Israel do. You might argue that it should be prevented in certain parts of the Temple Mount, which is another point of view. But at least you're now aware that there is an argument to be had about it.